There is a saying that has been passed around the north shore of Lake Gogebic for at least 3 generations. Not a formal thing. No one put it on a sign or printed it in the local paper. It circulates the way practical knowledge circulates in small lake communities through conversation at the boat launch, across the counter at the bait shop on the ice during walleye season when neighbors stand near each other's tip-ups and the cold gives them something to occupy their hands while they talk. The saying is simple. The dogman isn't the thing to be afraid of. What the people around Lake Gogebic mean when they say that is not that the dogman is harmless. What they mean is that after enough time living on that lake, in that forest, alongside something that has been there longer than any of them can account for, the creature itself stopped being the problem. The problem, as the people who live there year-round have learned, is everyone who comes looking for it. Before we go further, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what comes next. Thanks for being here. The man whose account is at the center of this story agreed to share what he knows on one condition. His name stays out of it. The property is still in his family. His wife still lives there. The last thing either of them needs is someone cross-referencing his name with a lake address and showing up at the end of a private road at 2 in the morning with a thermal camera and a YouTube channel. We'll call him Frank. That's not his real name. And once you understand what his family went through in the years after people started taking the dogman seriously as a destination, rather than a fact of life on the lake, you'll understand exactly why he asked. Lake Gogebic sits in the western end of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, straddling the Gogebic and Ontonagon County lines at an elevation of 1,296 feet above sea level. The name comes from the Ojibwe people who lived on this plateau for centuries before European contact. Gogebic, meaning roughly a body of water hanging on high. It is the largest inland lake in the Upper Peninsula, roughly 19 miles long and 1.5 miles wide at its broadest, sitting inside just under 13,500 acres of water. The North Shore runs along Highway M28 between the community of Bergland and Marinisco to the west. The Bergland Dam sits where the west branch of the Ontonagon River exits the lake, and the Upper Peninsula Power Company has regulated the lake level through that dam for decades. 8 tributaries feed in from the Ottawa National Forest on every side: Trout Brook, the Meriwether River, the Slate River, and 5 smaller creeks that drain the surrounding forest and wetlands before emptying into the lake's shallow northern and southern ends. The Ottawa National Forest wraps around Lake Gogebic on 3 sides. It is a nearly 1,000,000-acre tract of mixed northern hardwood and conifer forest, sugar maple, yellow birch, white pine, eastern hemlock, broken up by hundreds of lakes, thousands of miles of rivers and streams, and the swampy lowlands that pool in every drainage between the ridges. There are documented gray wolf packs on both sides of the lake. One works the territory west of the lake and crosses north of Highway M28 regularly. Another operates southwest, crossing south of Highway US 2 into Wisconsin occasionally. A third set of individual dispersers moves east of the lake along the drainage corridors toward Bruce Crossing and the Ontonagon River Valley. Black bears are common. Moose are spotted occasionally. The DNR confirmed a cougar breeding pair in nearby Ontonagon County in the mid-2000s, the first confirmed breeding in the state in generations. The forest around Lake Gogebic is functioning ecosystem, large predator habitat, old country. Frank's family came to Lake Gogebic in the early 1960s. His father, Stan, bought a property on the eastern shore, Ontonagon County side, when eastern shore lots were cheap because the county road coming around from Bergland was unpaved past a certain point and the eastern shore had fewer amenities than the west. Stan worked for a fish processing operation out of Ironwood and fished Lake Gogebic for walleye and perch for 35 years. He raised Frank on that lake. Frank learned to read water before he could read maps. He knew where the rock-to-mud transitions held walleye in fall, where the perch stacked up in the North Bay in summer, where the pike held in the weedy shallows off the creek mouths in early May. He knew the lake the way his father had taught him to know it, from the water looking outward, which meant knowing the forest that surrounded it in intimate detail, because the forest is what feeds a lake like Gogebic. Its insects, its runoff, its tannin load, its shade patterns, its seasonal pulse. Frank took over the property when Stan passed in the late 1990s. He was in his early 40s working a warehousing job in Ironwood, an hour's drive west on M28. He and his wife Rose moved into the lake property full-time a few years after that. Year-round residents on Lake Gogebic are a particular kind of people. Not the cottage families who show up in June and leave after Labor Day. The year-round people are the ones who know what 200 inches of snow looks like when it finishes falling, who have driven M28 in whiteout conditions at 7 in the morning in January because the shift starts whether the road is clear or not, who understand that the lake in November is a different place than the lake in July, and who have learned to read the winter forest the way Frank read the water, by paying attention to what was and was not in its usual place. His neighbor on the eastern shore, a man we'll call Mick, had lived on the lake even longer. Mick grew up on the lake. His family had been there since before the Ottawa National Forest was formally designated, back when this was still working timber country and the lumber companies ran roads through terrain that has since gone back to old growth. Mick knew things about that forest that he had been taught as a boy, and he taught some of what he knew to Frank over the years of their neighborly friendship. What Mick knew about the lake's long-term residents, the ones who did not show up at the Wildlife Agency's trapping surveys or the DNR's predator count transects, he shared carefully and in pieces, and only after he had decided Frank was the kind of man who could hear it without going sideways. The first time Mick said anything directly was in the fall of 2008. They were pulling Frank's boat out of the water for the season at the private launch at the end of Frank's Road. The light was going and it had gotten cold fast, that mid-October drop that turns everything in the UP from autumn to pre-winter in about 48 hours. Mick had helped Frank with the boat every fall for years. They were loading the last of the gear into Frank's truck when Mick said without particular preamble that there had been something crossing the creek mouth at the south end of Frank's property for the past 3 weeks. He said it walked on 2 legs and had a head that was wrong, canine where a human head should be. He had ruled out bear, ruled out wolf. Mick had seen it twice himself in the evening light, standing at the edge of the cedar swamp where the creek widened before it spilled into the lake. He said it was the kind of thing his grandfather used to mention when the subject came up of what else used the forest around the lake. He said his grandfather had called it the DOGMAN without any particular drama, as if it were simply one of the things you knew about if you had been on this lake long enough. Frank said he did not know what to say to that. He did not dismiss it. A man who has spent a lifetime reading Wild Country does not dismiss a report from another man who has spent a lifetime reading the same Wild Country. He just said he would pay attention. He paid attention for 6 years before he saw anything himself. Not nothing in those 6 years evidence accumulated the way it does when you know what to look for. Tracks in the mud at the creek mouth, large enough and wrongly shaped enough that he photographed them and spent time matching them against the bear and wolf track references in every field guide he owned, and found nothing that fit. Damage to the top rail of his dock in the late fall of 2010, long parallel gouges in the treated lumber that looked like claw marks but were too high and too far apart to belong to any animal that climbed up the pilings the conventional way. The railing section was 6 feet off the water at the dock's end, and whatever had gripped it had pressed 4 lines into the wood at a spread that Frank measured at 3.5 inches between the outermost marks. A black bear's front paw, fully splayed, tops out around 4.5 inches wide. These marks were made by something gripping, not raking. The depth was consistent across all 4 marks, like fingers closing. an unexplained incident in the summer of 2012 that Frank still cannot fully account for. A camp of young people from downstate who had rented a cottage half a mile south along the shore packed up and left at 11 o'clock at night, leaving a fire burning in the ring and their food unsecured on the picnic table. Frank found out from Mick the next day that one of them had told the cottage owner they had heard something outside the tent that they could not identify, and that when one of the young men went out with a flashlight to look, whatever had been making the sound had been standing at the tree line close enough that his flashlight caught the eye shine before it moved. The young man described the eyes as being at the height of his own face. He was 6 feet 1 inch tall. He did not stay outside to look more carefully. Frank did not start keeping a written log until 2014. He bought a standard field notebook, the kind with the waterproof cover, and started writing in it the way a naturalist logs observations, date, time, weather conditions, location, description. He did not think of it as collecting evidence toward any particular conclusion. He thought of it as doing what any careful person does when they are trying to understand something they have been noticing for years but have never organized. He wrote in it regularly. He dated every entry. He included sketches when the tracks were clear enough. By 2025, he had filled 11 notebooks which he kept in a locked file box under the workbench in his garage. He showed them to the researcher who eventually contacted this channel. He did not let the notebooks leave the property. What follows is drawn from what he described and what he showed. If you have ever spent time on the eastern shore of Lake Gogebic, or anywhere along M28 between Bergland and Bruce Crossing, you know the kind of country this is. The road runs through forest that closes overhead in summer and opens to a tunnel of bare branches and snow in winter, with nothing but the occasional driveway or lake access sign to remind you that people actually live in there. Let us know in the comments whether you have been on Lake Gogebic or anywhere in that stretch of the Upper Peninsula, and whether you have ever noticed anything unusual out there on a winter drive or a night on the water. Because the reports I have been going through from this area go back considerably further than Frank's story. The cedar swamp at the south end of Frank's property is the key to understanding what he documented over those 11 years. The Meriwether Creek drainage runs south to north through that swamp before widening at the creek mouth and spilling into the lake between 2 points of high ground. The swamp itself is maybe 80 acres of standing water, hummocks, and cedar root mats that make it nearly impassable on foot from late October through April when the ground is frozen but the ice on the hummocks is not reliable. The cedar stand in the swamp is old. The largest trees are close to 4 feet in diameter at the base. The canopy is dense enough that the swamp floor gets little direct light even in summer. The standing water does not freeze solid until January most years. It is the kind of terrain that provides cover, water, concealment, and access to the lake without requiring exposure on open ground. And according to everything Frank documented, the DOGMAN used it consistently as a travel corridor for the better part of a decade. What changed in 2014, what prompted Frank to start the written log, was the first time the thing came to him rather than him finding evidence it had been nearby. It was a night in late October. Frank had been out to check on his dock lines. The lake was kicking up from a northwest wind and he wanted to make sure the dock sections were still secured for their last few weeks in the water before he pulled them for the season. He was walking back up the path from the dock to the house with a flashlight. A path he had walked thousands of times in the dark when he stopped. Stopped involuntarily, the way you stop when something catches in your peripheral vision faster than your conscious mind can process it. He turned toward the tree line on the south side of the path, about 40 feet from where he stood. Something was standing at the edge of the trees. Standing upright, in the flashlight's throw, which extended maybe 60 feet on a calm night but was getting chopped up by the wind, Frank could see the silhouette of a figure at the transition between the mowed grass of his yard and the edge of the cedar stand. The height was wrong for a person. Taller than any person Frank knew, and he is not a small man himself. The shoulders were too wide for the height, and the head was not right. The profile of the head was forward projected, the way an animal's head projects forward from the neck. Not the flat face of a human or a bear, a muzzle. He could see the shape of it against the pale edge where his flashlight caught the first cedars. Frank said he stood there for what he believes was close to 30 seconds. He did not move. The figure at the tree line did not move either. Both of them were still in that October wind with the dock lines banging and the lake noise behind Frank. And neither one of them did anything. He said he was not afraid in the way that makes you run. He was afraid in a different way, a deep and very quiet fear that feels more like awe than panic. Then the figure turned, not toward him, away from him, rotating its body at the shoulder with a smoothness that a bear cannot achieve, and it moved into the cedar stand without sound that he could hear over the wind, and was gone. He went inside. He woke Rose and told her what he had seen. She did not disbelieve him. She had lived on that lake long enough, and she had heard mixed accounts over the years. She told him to write it down before the details blurred. He got the field notebook he kept in the kitchen junk drawer for grocery lists and used it to write 3 pages of notes at the kitchen table at 10:30 at night. 2 cups of coffee going cold beside him while Rose sat across from him and asked questions that kept him from skipping details. That notebook became the first of 11. The next morning he drove to Ironwood and bought 3 Moultrie trail cameras. He mounted the first on a cedar at the creek mouth, aimed across the opening where the creek entered the lake. He mounted the second inside the cedar stand 50 yards south of the creek mouth, aimed along the most obvious travel corridor through the swamp, a slight rise in the ground that stayed drier than the surrounding hummocks and showed the most compressed vegetation. He mounted the third on the east side of his property where the cedar swamp met the grassy margin of his yard, covering the tree-line position where he had seen the figure the night before. He changed the SD cards every 2 weeks. He told no one except Mick. The cameras ran for 4 months before the first useful recording. This is important to understand because anyone who has run trail cameras in active predator country knows that 2 things happen. Cameras capture a lot of useless data, and cameras that are regularly triggered by deer and raccoons and wind-blown branches are easy to dismiss when they capture something that does not fit. Frank understood this. He kept the record systematically, downloading every image and video clip into folders organized by date and camera position, reviewing everything himself, making notes in the log when something warranted it. What he was looking for was not necessarily a direct image. He was looking for pattern. When did movement happen? In what corridor? In which direction? How often? At what time of night? By March of 2015, he had enough pattern to know that something was using the creek mouth crossing consistently on nights with no moon, or with overcast that blocked the moon between 10 at night and 3 in the morning. Moving from south to north approximately twice a week during the winter months. The cameras caught deer constantly, mostly before midnight. The wolf pack that ranged along the east side of the lake showed up occasionally on the inner swamp camera, always moving with their characteristic ground-covering efficiency. Once a black bear that should have been den triggered the creek mouth camera in January. A large male that the DNR's predator monitors might have found interesting if anyone had reported it. All of this was background. The cameras had captured nothing that explained the tracks at the creek mouth or the figure Frank had seen in October. The first significant capture came on the night of March the 9th, 2015. The inner swamp camera aimed along the dry ground travel corridor inside the cedar stand. The timestamp read 11:47 in the evening. The temperature had been in the low single digits that day, cold enough to firm up the hummock ice and make the swamp interior passable on foot. The recording is a standard Moultrie infrared clip, triggered by motion, overcast night, no ambient light. Frank described it to me in detail. What the camera caught was movement at the far edge of the frame, approximately 60 feet from the camera, moving from right to left across the corridor at a pace that covered the full width of the frame in a few seconds. The infrared resolved a figure moving upright on two legs with a stride length that Frank estimated at close to 4 feet per step. He had paced the same corridor himself and knew the tree spacing that provided reference. The figure was tall. Taller than Frank, who is 6'2". It moved fluidly and without the swaying of a bear moving bipedally, which bears do in a lumbering, weight-shifting manner that looks uncertain and effortful. This moved the way something that walks upright is supposed to move, with a continuous and controlled transfer of weight, arms swinging with a longer hang than a human's arms produce, head level. The head profile in infrared, even at 60 feet, showed the forward projection he had seen in his yard. Frank said that watching it, the wrongness of it was not in any single detail. The wrongness was in how right it looked, how natural the movement was. That, he said, was what stayed with him for the weeks afterward as he reviewed the clip multiple times. It moved like it was at home. He showed the clip to Mick. Mick watched it twice, hands in his jacket pockets, and said nothing for a long time. Then he said that was the one that used the south end of the property. He said there was at least one more that worked the north end of the lake, over toward where the Slate River came in. He said he had seen that one once years earlier, and that it was larger than what was on the camera. Frank asked how Mick knew they were different animals. Mick said the one he had seen up north left tracks that were wider in the foot than the ones at the creek mouth, and that its range did not seem to overlap with the south end animals. He said they each kept to their own section of shoreline, which he took to mean they had divided the lake territory somehow between them. He was not certain about any of this. He was describing what he had observed over decades, the way a man describes wildlife behavior he has been watching his whole life without necessarily being able to explain why things work the way they do. There is a thread in the documented history of the Michigan DOGMAN that runs straight through what Frank was observing on the eastern shore of Lake Gogebic, and it is worth pulling on for a moment. The first documented modern account in Michigan comes from 1887, which happens to be the same year Gogebic County was officially organized and partitioned from Ontonagon County. The Wexford County Lumberjack account that year described a bipedal creature with a man's torso and a dog's head encountered by a logging crew in the northern Lower Peninsula. That account was dismissed, then rediscovered a century later when Steve Cook, a radio disc jockey at a station in Traverse City, wrote a song called The Legend as an April Fool's Day prank in 1987. The prank misfired. The station's phone lines were jammed with people who had never heard of the 1987 account and could not have known the song was a joke, people who called to say they had seen exactly what the song described. Cook spent years afterward collecting those accounts, and what he found was a body of testimony from across both Michigan peninsulas that matched in its core details. Bipedal, canine-headed, large, fast, nocturnal, associated with water, and not aggressive toward humans unless humans push the encounter into confrontation. The 10-year cycle legend attached itself to the phenomenon through Cook's song. The idea that the DOGMAN became more active in years ending in 7, but the reports Linda Godfrey collected over 3 decades of field research don't support a strict cycle. They support consistent year-round presence in territories that have been occupied for as long as anyone has been paying attention. What Mick's grandfather had known about the lake, what Mick had learned from him, sits inside a much longer tradition than the 1987 song or even the 1887 lumberjack account. The Lac Vieux Desert Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa maintains a reservation about 35 miles southeast of Lake Gogebic, near Watersmeet, at the confluence of 3 major river drainages, which is exactly the kind of terrain, waterway-rich and forested, that the people who lived here before European contact understood as inhabited by beings that required respectful behavior from humans passing through. The Lac Vieux Desert Band signed the Treaty of 1842 at La Pointe, Wisconsin, ceding the land around Lake Gogebic and the Ottawa National Forest to the United States government while retaining treaty rights to hunt, fish, and gather in the ceded territory. The old trail between Lac Vieux Desert and Lens to the north, which the Ojibwe used for centuries before European contact and tribal members continued to walk into the 1940s, ran through the terrain east and north of Lake Gogebic. That trail, and the knowledge that traveled along it, carried an understanding of the land that is documented in the tribe's own historical records and in the work of anthropologists who spent time with Lake Superior Ojibwe communities in the early 20th century. The Anishinaabe world is populated by beings they call Manitou, a word that translates approximately as spirit but carries a meaning closer to the fundamental animating power in any living or significant thing. Some Manitou are protective, some are dangerous, some are neither but are powerful in ways that demand acknowledgement and proper conduct from humans who move through their territories. The beings the older Ojibwe residents and elders on the Lake Gogebic shore were willing to discuss carefully with people who had earned some trust fall into this category. Beings associated with the forest and the water margins that have been part of the landscape's inhabited reality for longer than any human community's memory reaches. They are not discussed with outsiders as a matter of cultural protocol that has nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the understanding that certain kinds of knowledge carry responsibility, and that responsibility is not transferable to people who have no framework for it. An elder from the Lac Vieux Desert Band, who was known to some of the older Gogebic families in the 1970s and 80s, was quoted in a private letter that a longtime resident showed Frank years ago as saying that the forest around the lake had its own owners, and that the families who had lived there for generations knew enough to conduct themselves accordingly. That letter has never been made public. The family that holds it chooses to keep it private. But Frank has seen it, and he confirmed its existence to me. Mick's grandfather had absorbed some of that understanding through decades of living adjacent to it, through conversations with Ojibwe neighbors and through his own observation of a landscape that rewarded careful attention. He passed what he understood to Mick, and Mick passed pieces of it to Frank. And what Frank took from it was practical. There are things in this forest that have been here longer than you, that have their own habits and territories and requirements, and your job is to be a decent enough neighbor that the arrangement stays comfortable for everyone. That was not fear. That was the same attitude a sensible year-round lake resident takes toward the wolf pack that ranges through the property in February. Respect it. Don't crowd it. Understand that you are in its territory as much as it is in yours, and act accordingly. For the first several years of Frank's log keeping, the arrangement was comfortable. The dogman at the south end of the property used the cedar swamp and the creek mouth corridor consistently. It triggered his cameras on a predictable schedule, moving north through the swamp on winter nights and south again before dawn. The wolf pack used some of the same terrain, but the timing did not overlap. Frank noted across dozens of camera events that when the wolf pack had moved through the swamp in the previous 24 hours, the dogman's trail showed a 12 to 16-hour delay, as if it were waiting for the wolves to clear the corridor before resuming its own movement. He could not know what the interaction between the two species looked like, if they ever encountered each other directly. What the camera data showed was a traffic management that suggested awareness of each other, with the dogman yielding precedence. That is not the behavior of an animal operating on pure instinct and territorial aggression. That is the behavior of an animal making calculated decisions about risk. There were incidents across those years that Frank logged but could not fully explain. The summer of 2016, when a group of dock fishermen from a rental cottage 2 properties north reported seeing something standing in the shallows at the creek mouth at dusk and took a photograph on a phone camera that was blurry enough to be unverifiable but sharp enough to show a figure taller than the dock post it stood beside. Frank knew the dock post height from when he had helped Mick install it years earlier, 6 feet above the waterline. The figure in the photograph was taller. The rental group left a day early. The fall of 2017, which was a 7-year in the decade cycle, and Frank does not believe the cycle explains much, but 2017 brought a noticeable uptick in people driving M28 and turning down lake access roads looking for what Steve Cook's song had promised them. That fall, Frank found 3 separate sets of human footprints in the soft soil at the creek mouth on 3 separate occasions, each time accompanied by evidence that whoever had been there at night: a discarded flashlight battery, a cigarette butt, a ground impression where someone had been kneeling. People were coming to the property looking for the Dogman, and they had no idea that their presence was doing exactly what Frank had begun to understand it would do: displacing the animal from a corridor it had used without incident for years, creating the kind of unpredictable human traffic that a territorial intelligence had every reason to respond to with heightened caution or heightened aggression. The cameras were damaged for the first time in November of 2017, not destroyed, adjusted. The inner swamp camera had been rotated on its mounting strap, turned approximately 45 degrees so that it now pointed at the sky rather than down the travel corridor. The strap had not been cut. The camera had not been taken. The housing was intact. The SD card showed the last motion event before the camera went offline. 12 seconds of darkness, then a shape rising from below the frame. A large hand coming into view, thick-fingered, closing around the camera housing. Then the image spun and the next frame was out of focus branches and cloud cover. Frank retrieved the card, reviewed the footage, sat in his truck for a long time in his own driveway. He told Mick. Mick said it had happened to his cameras twice, years before Frank had started running his own, and that in his experience the camera being adjusted rather than destroyed was a communication rather than an act of destruction. He said it was telling you it knows and that it is choosing to let you know it knows. The difference between that and simply breaking the camera is significant, Mick said. Something that wanted your cameras gone could crush the housing. Something that wanted you to know it had found your camera and made a deliberate decision about it will leave the camera intact and pointed at the sky. Frank replaced the camera in a new position, mounted higher, aimed at a different section of the corridor. The new camera ran for 6 weeks before it was adjusted in the same manner. He replaced it a second time. The third camera he mounted at 14 feet using a ladder aimed down at a steep angle along the near ground of the travel corridor. That one was not touched. He believed the height made it harder to reach without leaving marks on the tree that would have been obvious, and that whatever had been adjusting the lower cameras had made a similar calculation, that pulling down a camera at 14 feet was more effort and more exposure than the cost of tolerating it. The camera at 14 feet ran for 2 years and captured 11 events that Frank considers significant, including the 3 that he describes as the most compelling evidence in his 11 notebooks. The first of those 3 significant recordings came in January of 2019, on a night when the temperature was below 0 and the snow was dry and compacted. The swamp was fully frozen. The camera caught 2 figures moving through the corridor, 5 or 6 feet apart, moving in the same direction at the same pace. The larger one was in front. The smaller one followed with a matching stride that suggested it was younger or possibly female, but Frank had no basis for determining sex from infrared footage in the dark. What he noted in his log that night was the coordination. They were not 2 animals happening to travel in the same direction. They were traveling together, maintaining a consistent interval, with the smaller one adjusting its pace to stay in position relative to the larger. He watched the clip 6 times. The second time, he noticed that the larger figure turned its head back toward the smaller one midway through the crossing. A brief rotation that lasted less than a second but was visible in the infrared as the heat signature of the face briefly presenting toward the trailing camera direction. It was checking on the one behind it. The way you glance back at someone walking with you to confirm they are still with you. Frank wrote 4 pages in his log that night about what he thought he was looking at. He had been keeping the log for 5 years by then, and in those 5 years he had accumulated enough behavioral data to be reasonably confident about what the evidence showed and did not show. What it showed was a breeding pair, or at minimum 2 adults that were traveling in an organized, socially connected manner through a territory they had been using consistently for years. What it did not show was aggression, territoriality toward humans, or any behavior that suggested either animal viewed the humans on the lake as prey or threat. The camera adjustments had been communication, here I know you are watching, but not warning. The dock damage had been incidental, or possibly investigative. The presence at the tree line in Frank's yard in 2014 had been observation. None of it had escalated toward contact. The arrangement, as Frank had understood it from mixed description of his grandfather's understanding, was holding. The dogman used the swamp, the creek mouth, and the lake margin for its own purposes, and the lake's year-round families knew it was there and conducted themselves accordingly, and the balance held. What broke the balance in Frank's telling was not anything he did. It was not anything Mick did. It was the people who started coming from outside the community in the years after Dogman content spread widely enough online that Lake Gogebic became a named location in Dogman research circles. He does not blame researchers. He does not particularly blame the YouTube channels or the podcast hosts or the people who run forums dedicated to compiling encounter reports. He blames the gap between what you can learn from watching content online and what you need to know to move responsibly through someone else's territory, and he means that phrase to apply to the territory of the dogman as much as to the territory of the families who live on the lake year-round. The people who started coming to the lake after 2017 were not all irresponsible. Some of them were careful and stayed on public land and did not bother anyone. But some of them were not careful. Some of them drove down private roads. Some of them set up cameras on other people's property without asking. Some of them walked the cedar swamp at night with lights and voice recorders, deliberately trying to provoke a response. Those were the ones who changed the dynamic on the south end of Frank's property. And those were the ones whose actions produced the event in the fall of 2021 that Frank describes as the worst night of the whole 11 years. The second of the 3 significant camera events had happened in the spring of 2020, the year before the worst night, and it established a piece of context that Frank says is essential to understanding what the fall of 2021 meant. The spring of 2020 was a strange year on the lake for reasons the rest of the world also noticed. Human traffic on the lake dropped to essentially nothing in April and May. The cottage season did not start. The boat launches sat empty. The roads were quiet. And the dogman's behavior in the cedar swamp changed in a way that Frank documented carefully. The interval between camera events shortened dramatically. The animal that had been crossing the corridor twice a week in winter months began appearing 4 or 5 times a week, then nightly through April and into May. The pattern shifted toward earlier evening crossings, sometimes while there was still light in the western sky, which Frank had never observed before. The most striking event of that spring came in early May when the creek mouth camera, the original position he had used since 2015, captured the figure standing at the creek mouth in full daylight, shortly after 6 in the evening, and standing there long enough for the camera to record a clip lasting nearly a minute. The figure stood at the water's edge looking out at the lake, standing at the edge between the swamp and the open water, in the last of the evening light, and looking out over the water the way you look at something you have known your whole life and find comfort in seeing again. Frank said that clip is the one he thinks about most, not the flanking motion in the corridor and not the hand reaching for the camera. The creature standing at the edge of his lake in the evening light of a spring when no one else came to the lake, looking out over the water. He said it was the only time in 11 years of documentation that what he was watching did not feel like surveillance or evidence gathering. He said it felt like witnessing something private. He almost did not write it up in the log. He did because he had committed to writing everything, but he felt strange about it, the same way you feel strange when you accidentally see something not meant for your eyes. By early 2021, the outside traffic to the lake had resumed and intensified. The spring of 2020 had been a pause. What came after was worse than before. Groups of 3 and 4 people in the cedar swamp at night. Calls to the county sheriff's office from Frank and 2 other year-round residents about trespassing on private property. The online DOGMAN community had located the general area by this point, and some among them had identified the specific drainage corridor along the creek as a focus of historical sighting reports. The cedar swamp and the creek mouth had become a destination. The wolf pack, which had ranged through the swamp on its own schedule for years, shifted its range. The wolves do not like human foot traffic in their regular corridors, and they moved north. The DOGMAN's camera events dropped sharply. Frank went from 11 events in the 4 months of spring to 3 events in the entire summer and fall of 2021 combined. The swamp was being walked at night by people who did not know what they were walking into or what they were displacing, and the displacement was working. The thing that had used that corridor for over a decade was gone. What happened in October of 2021 happened at the public boat launch at Bergland, on the west shore of the lake, where Frank had driven to pick up a part for his outboard motor that a friend had dropped off. It was a Saturday afternoon, late enough that the fall light was going flat and gold, the kind of afternoon that makes the lake look like something from a painting. There were 4 people at the launch, and Frank recognized the setup immediately. The kind of thermal camera rigs and audio equipment that a certain type of investigator brings to a location they expect to be productive. He knew 2 of them had been in the cedar swamp. He had found their boot prints there 3 weeks earlier. Frank is not a confrontational man. Confrontational. He said so several times in the account he gave me. But 11 years of careful documentation, 11 years of watching a careful and intelligent animal navigate a landscape that it had shared with his family without incident. 11 years of seeing that arrangement eroded by people who had no relationship with either the lake or what lived on it. 11 years of that produces a kind of quiet fury in a careful man that does not look like anger from the outside. It looks like the face of someone who has decided to say something he has been keeping to himself for a very long time. He walked over to them. He did not yell. He said in the flat and matter-of-fact voice of a man who has thought through what he is going to say, that they should know the DOGMAN wasn't the thing to be afraid of on this lake. They looked at him. One of them asked what he meant. Frank said what he meant was that the thing they had come to find was still there and still fine, but that he could not say the same about their odds if the year-round families on the eastern shore started taking a harder line about trespassing on private property than the county sheriff was currently inclined to take. He said the creature in the swamp had been minding its own business for longer than anyone in the parking lot had been alive, and that the people who had been living alongside it for generations had managed the relationship fine until it became entertainment for strangers. He said he would appreciate it if they moved their operation to public land and stayed there. Then he got his outboard part and drove home. He told Rose what he had done. She said it was about time. He said he felt exposed saying that much out loud. She said the thing was going to be fine regardless. She said it had managed itself through the logging era, through the cottage era, through the snowmobile era, and it would manage itself through the internet era too. She was probably right. But the 3 camera events from the fall of 2021, all of them after the conversation at the boat launch and all of them showing the figure back in the creek mouth corridor, gave Frank something he had not had in months, evidence that it was still there and still using the swamp. It had not left. It had been quiet. There is a difference. The third significant camera event, the one Frank places last in what he considers the sequence that matters most, happened in February of 2022. A cold night, temperature around -8, the lake locked under ice that the snowmobile clubs had drilled and confirmed at over a foot thick. The inner swamp camera, the one mounted at 14 feet, aimed down at the travel corridor. The timestamp was 12 minutes past midnight. The clip captured the figure moving through the corridor in its established pattern, south to north, but it stopped at a point almost directly below the camera. Not for a moment, for over a minute. The infrared showed the heat signature of the face tilting upward, looking at the camera, and then the figure raised one hand. The same deliberate, controlled movement he had documented when the lower cameras were adjusted, and extended a single finger upward, pointing at the camera. One finger, extended and held for a count that Frank said he timed at 4 seconds on his stopwatch when he reviewed the clip at home the next morning. Then the hand came down. The figure turned and continued north through the corridor, the same unhurried gait it had used for 11 years, and disappeared into the cedar stand. Frank sat with that footage for 3 days before he told anyone. He showed it to Mick. Mick watched it twice, the same way he watched everything, arms folded, face still, without performing any reaction he did not actually feel. When the clip ended the second time, Mick said he had heard about this kind of thing from his grandfather. He said the old man had described accounts from people on the lake, decades earlier, of the creature making gestures that seemed deliberate, not threatening, not communicative in the way a person gestures to convey a specific meaning. Deliberate in the way that something makes a gesture when it wants to establish without any ambiguity that it is aware of your presence and has been for some time. Mick said his grandfather believed the gesture was acknowledgement, a recognition of the long-term coexistence. Here is what I know. Here is what I have chosen to do with what I know. Here is the evidence that I am making choices, not just behaving. Frank cannot tell you with certainty what the gesture meant. He is not prepared to make that claim, and he knows how it would sound if he did. What he can tell you is what he documented. Over 11 years, a large bipedal animal with canine morphology used the cedar swamp and creek drainage on the south end of his property consistently, and in ways that demonstrated awareness of his monitoring operation, response to changed conditions in the shared environment, deliberate restraint across every interaction that could have gone differently, and on one occasion a behavior that cannot be explained within the vocabulary available for describing animal cognition without straining that vocabulary in ways that most people in positions of institutional authority are not prepared to strain it. He documented it carefully. He kept the records. He is not interested in being believed by everyone. He is interested in the record existing. What the 11 notebooks document, taken together, is a behavioral profile that matches everything Linda Godfrey found in 30 years of Great Lakes DOGMAN research, and everything that Steve Cook's collected accounts describe. The territorial consistency, the nocturnal pattern with occasional daylight exceptions, the association with water, specifically the swamp and creek corridor that connects interior forest to the lake margin, the intelligence demonstrated through camera awareness, through timing that tracked the wolfpack's movements, through the adjustment of Frank's monitoring equipment, and the pointed tolerance of replacement cameras that could not be easily reached. The restraint, consistent year after year across every opportunity for escalation that a territorial animal of that size would have had. The presence at the tree line in Frank's yard had not come closer. The dock damage had not recurred. The figure at the boat launch in 2021 because Frank believes something was watching that exchange from the shoreline trees, though he cannot prove it, had not been part of the conversation. It had watched. Everything it did was watching and measuring and choosing. What the broader Michigan DOGMAN record shows is that this kind of long-term presence in a defined territory is not unique to Lake Gogebic. The Manistee National Forest in Lake County has produced enough consistent reports over enough years that the southern half of the Lower Peninsula's DOGMAN geography maps almost entirely to the forest and water corridors between the Manistee and the Pere Marquette. The Lake Superior corridor in the Upper Peninsula, from the Porcupine Mountains east through the Ontonagon River watershed, has a thread of accounts going back to accounts collected by the same generation of Ojibwe elders who were already describing these animals when the first Finnish and Scandinavian settlers arrived in the UP to work the copper mines and the logging camps in the 1880s and 90s. Those workers came from a northern European tradition that had its own framework for large, intelligent, man-adjacent beings in the deep forest. A framework different enough from the Anishinaabe understanding that the two traditions talked past each other for generations, but arriving at similar conclusions from different angles. Something large and smart lives in the northern forest and has done so for longer than any culture in this hemisphere can document. The specifics differ. The core observation does not. The institutional silence around this region's encounter history is different from the silence around other documented DOGMAN areas. In places like the Umatilla Depot or the Douglas County Timber Country, the silence is enforced by professional incentive and organizational self-interest. Around Lake Gogebic, the silence is older and more personal. It is the silence of a lake community that has spent 3 generations working out a functional relationship with something that could have made that relationship much harder, and that has chosen not to, and whose choice deserves to be met with equivalent discretion from the human side of the arrangement. The people on the lake who know what is in the swamp do not talk about it publicly because they are protecting something that has protected or at minimum declined to harm their families for 60 years. That is a different kind of silence than institutional cover-up. It is closer to the silence that any community maintains around arrangements that work. You do not explain them to people who have not earned the context to understand them. The county sheriff's office in Ontonagon County has handled several trespassing complaints from the lake's east shore over the years. None of the deputy reports reference anything unusual about what prompted the complaints. Landowners cite trespassers accessing private property after dark. The reports note the trespassers, most of them from downstate or from Wisconsin, were conducting what the deputies generally log as wildlife observation activities. No charges filed, mostly. A warning, a clear-out, the usual handling. The deputies who have patrolled the East Shore Road at night know the territory. Some of them grew up in the area. None of them have filed reports describing unusual wildlife encounters in the cedar swamp or at the creek mouth. This is unremarkable on its face. What would such a report look like in the Ontonagon County Incident Management System? What category captures it? What is the follow-up protocol? The system has no mechanism for it, and the deputies who grew up in this country are not more eager than anyone else to be the one who tests the system's edges. Mick retired from the seasonal boat repair operation he had run for 30 years a while after Frank's boat launch conversation. He spends more time on the ice now in winter than he used to, and less time in the cedar swamp. He told Frank in one of their conversations about what Frank had documented, that he believed the 2 animals Frank had recorded evidence of were probably the same pair his grandfather had first observed or their descendants. The behavioral territory matched exactly what the old man had described: the creek mouth crossing, the north end of the lake near the Slate River, the seasonal adjustment toward the lake margin in winter when the swamp interior froze solid enough to use. Those patterns were older than Frank's cameras, older than Frank's property, older than the cottage era on Lake Gogebic. Mick's grandfather believed they had been using those corridors since before the logging companies cut the first roads into that country in the 1890s, and probably long before that. What that implies about what we are looking at is something Frank is willing to sit with but not willing to resolve. He does not know what they are. He knows what he has documented. He knows how to read animal behavior from years of observation. And he knows that what he observed does not fit any taxonomy available to him. He knows the Anishinaabe tradition around the lake carries a framework for understanding beings like these that is older and more carefully considered than anything the Michigan DNR's predator monitoring program can offer. He knows the arrangement that the lake's year-round families have maintained for generations works, and that it works because the families treat the arrangement with respect, and because the dogman or dogmen treat it with equivalent consideration. He does not know whether that consideration is strategic intelligence or something closer to what Mick's grandfather believed, that these beings understand the human world well enough to navigate it on terms of their own choosing, and that their choice to coexist rather than confront represents a decision made at a level of awareness that we do not have good language for. The spring of 2023 brought the most active camera season Frank had recorded since before the outside traffic intensified. 18 events across the 3 months of April, May, and June, which Frank calculates as the highest density since his second full year of monitoring. The South End animal had returned to its full seasonal pattern. The late spring event that Frank's wife logged while he was in Ironwood for a medical appointment. She had been keeping the camera record since he started the log, reviewing every clip, cross-referencing timestamps against his entries, showed the pair together at the creek mouth in early June, standing in the shallow water where the creek widened before entering the lake, at a time of day approaching 11 in the morning. Rose described the clip in her own handwriting in the log as simply the two of them standing in the creek, not doing anything in particular. She wrote that the small one was looking toward the dock, and the large one was facing the cedar stand, and that they stayed in the frame for about 4 minutes before the recording ended, and she could not see if they walked out of the frame or simply waited long enough for the motion trigger to time out. She wrote at the bottom of the page in her characteristically direct way, "They are comfortable here." She underlined it. He left it underlined. Frank is in his early 60s now. He does not know how long he and Rose will stay on the lake. The winters are harder than they used to be, not because the weather has changed, but because the body does. At some point, he told me they will probably go somewhere with less snow. When they do, he will pass the property to a family member who he has already spoken to about the cedar swamp and what uses it. He has already started what amounts to a briefing process, the same kind of careful piecemeal education that Mick's grandfather gave to Mick and that Mick gave to Frank over years of conversation at the boat launch and on the ice. You do not dump 11 notebooks worth of observation on someone at once and expect them to absorb it. You let them pay attention first. You let them see what there is to see. You answer questions when they arise. You give them enough to understand the shape of the arrangement without overwhelming them with the anxiety of knowing more than they are ready for. You trust the lake to do the rest of the teaching because the lake has been teaching people who are willing to pay attention for a very long time. The notebooks are in the locked box under the workbench. The cameras are still running on the 14-foot mounts. The cedar swamp is still there, still frozen solid in February and still a maze of hummocks and standing water in July, still carrying the Meriwether Creek drainage down from the interior forest to the edge of the largest inland lake in the Upper Peninsula. The wolf pack has ranged back into its old territory along the east shore. The walleye run in April draws the same clusters of fishing boats it always has, anchored over the same rock-to-mud transitions Frank's father showed him when he was 10 years old. The loons are back on the North Bay where they have nested every summer anyone on the lake can remember. What Frank wants people to understand, and he was careful about how he said this, choosing words that had nothing performative in them, is not that the dogman is dangerous or that the lake is a place to fear. He wants people to understand that there is a difference between a place that has something old and intelligent living in it and a destination that you treat as a background for an experience you have decided to have. The difference matters to the wildlife, which responds to human behavior that does not respect the landscape as inhabited rather than empty. It matters to the year-round families who have maintained the inhabited landscape's balance for generations. And it matters, Frank believes, to the thing in the swamp, which has demonstrated over 11 years of documented behavior that it understands the difference between humans who belong to the lake and humans who are passing through it. He does not know what it thinks about him. He is not willing to claim that. He knows what it has done across 11 years of coexistence, and what it has done is this: use the creek corridor and the lake margin for its own purposes, acknowledged the presence of his cameras without destroying them, made the deliberate choice on every occasion when a different choice was available to avoid escalating contact with the family on the adjacent property, and in February of 2022, stood under a camera in the dark at midnight and raised one hand with one finger extended toward the lens and held it there for 4 seconds. He does not know what that means. He is at peace with not knowing. The lake is still the lake. The swamp is still the swamp. Whatever is in the cedar stand at the south end of his property has been in the cedar stand longer than the Berglund Dam has been regulating the lake level, longer than Highway M28 has been paved, longer than the Ottawa National Forest has had a name. It was there when the Anishinaabe traveled the old trail between Lac Vieux Desert and Lens. It was there when the first Finnish immigrant families came north to work the copper mines and stayed to build houses on the lake shore. It was there when Stan bought the East Shore property in the early 1960s and taught his son to read the water from the inside out. It will be there when Frank and Rose are gone, when the property passes to the next generation, when the briefing process begins again. The lake holds its own history in its water and its sediment and its cedar swamps and the dark corridors between the hummocks where a presence older than any of us, walking on 2 legs toward the water every winter night and stands at the edge, in the cold, looking out at the ice. The saying on the lake is right. The dogman isn't the thing to be afraid of. What you should be careful of is coming to a place with deep and working arrangements and treating it as though it has none. Every place that is really wild has its long tenants. Lake Gogebic has them. They know you are there before you arrive, and they have already decided what to do about it by the time your headlights hit the end of the road. That is the understanding Frank carries from 11 years of watching a corridor that most people drive past at 60 miles an hour on M28 and never think about. The cedar swamps along the Meriwether drainage are not empty. The East Shore Road in Ontonagon County that dead ends at private property is not a destination. The boat launch at Berglund is not the beginning of an expedition. It is the edge of an inhabited place, inhabited in every sense of that word, by the families who have made their lives on the lake and by something older than those families that made its home here first and has chosen, across more years than anyone can fully account for, to tolerate the company. The families know it. The lake knows it. The thing in the swamp knows it. The only ones who have ever needed to be told are the ones who came from somewhere else and assumed the wilderness was empty because they could not see what was in it. Frank still runs his cameras. He still writes in the log. The entry count is past 400 now. He has not decided what to do with the notebooks when the time comes. He will figure that out, he said, when the time comes. For now, they stay in the locked box under the workbench, and the cameras stay in the cedar stand, and the arrangement holds.